I never imagined my last semester of college would bring such an unexpected turn. It was supposed to be routine: classes, late-night studying, and the occasional party. Instead, it became the most confusing, exhilarating, and profoundly intimate experience of my life. When my old roommate moved out, I wasn't expecting much from my new one. Aaron arrived with little more than a backpack, a guitar case, and a quiet air of mystery. At 24, he was a bit older than the other students in our building, having taken time off to travel before returning to finish his degree. His calm confidence was the opposite of my restless energy. From the first day, we were an odd pair. Aaron was reserved, almost stoic, while I, Elliot, had a habit of filling silence with chatter. Yet there was something about him that made the apartment feel different, charged in a way I couldn't quite name. It started subtly. Shared cups of coffee in the morning turned into late-night conversations. Aaron had a way of listening that made you feel seen. His gray eyes focused with an intensity that was both unnerving and magnetic. He'd nod, his mouth curving into a faint smile as if he knew more than he let on. It wasn't long before I found myself looking forward to those moments, lingering in the kitchen or on the couch, hoping he'd stay just a little longer. One night, after a long study session, Aaron found me slumped on the couch. The glow of the TV bathed the room in soft light as I half-heartedly flipped through channels. "Tough day." His voice was low, warm, cutting through the haze of my thoughts. I nodded. "Finals. And I think my brain has officially quit." Aaron chuckled, a sound that sent a surprising warmth through me. "Come on, then." He nodded toward the kitchen. "I'll make tea." It was such a small thing, and yet, as I followed him, something about the simplicity of the moment felt significant. He moved with effortless grace, the way his hands worked the teapot and the precision of his movements mesmerizing. "You've been carrying a lot on your shoulders lately," Aaron said, breaking the silence. His gaze lingered on me, his expression unreadable. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "It's just school. You know how it is." But his eyes held mine for a moment too long, and I felt the air shift, the unspoken weight between us growing heavier. "You don't always have to hold it together," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. Aaron's words lingered in the air long after they were spoken. "You don't always have to hold it together." Something in the way he said it felt like a subtle unraveling of a thread I hadn't even realized I'd been clinging to. I looked at him, unsure of how to respond. His eyes, those gray depths that seemed to see straight through me, didn't waver. For a moment I considered brushing it off with a laugh or a quick change of subject, but the sincerity in his expression held me. "Sometimes it feels like I do," I admitted softly, the vulnerability in my voice surprising even me. It wasn't like me to open up, especially to someone I'd only known for a few months. Aaron didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, his gaze thoughtful as he poured steaming water into the mugs. The quiet was comforting, not awkward, as if he understood that words weren't necessary. He slid a mug across the counter toward me, his fingers brushing mine briefly. The touch was casual, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Drink," he said with a faint smile, his voice steady but gentle. "It helps." I took a sip, the warmth spreading through me, though I wasn't sure if it was from the tea or the way Aaron's presence seemed to fill the space around us. The kitchen was dimly lit, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound besides our breathing. I found myself hyper-aware of every detail: the way his shirt clung to his shoulders, the way his lips curved slightly as he sipped his tea, the quiet confidence in the way he stood. "You're different than most people I know," I said suddenly, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Aaron raised an eyebrow, his expression amused but curious. "Different how?" "I don't know," I said, fumbling for an explanation. "You're just calm. Like you don't let things get to you. It's grounding." His smile widened slightly, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, something deeper, more complicated. "Maybe I've just learned how to carry it differently," he said after a moment. It was such a simple statement, yet it carried weight, as if he were letting me glimpse a part of himself he usually kept hidden. I wanted to ask him what he meant, to dig deeper into the layers of this person who had somehow become such an integral part of my life. But the look in his eyes stopped me. There was a quiet vulnerability there, a hint of something fragile that I instinctively knew not to push. Instead, I nodded, letting the moment settle between us. We stayed there, leaning against opposite sides of the counter, sipping our tea in companionable silence. It was one of those rare, quiet moments that felt more intimate than words could convey, a shared understanding that didn't need to be spoken aloud. As the days passed, I found myself looking forward to those moments with Aaron more and more. He had a way of making me feel seen, of peeling back the layers of my defenses without ever pushing too hard. There was an ease to his presence, a quiet strength that drew me in, even as I tried to resist the pull. But there was something else, too, something I couldn't quite name. It was in the way his gaze lingered just a second too long, the way his hand would brush against mine in passing, the way his voice softened when he spoke to me. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it was enough to make my heart race every time we were alone together. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, I came home to find Aaron sprawled on the couch, his guitar resting on his lap. He was strumming idly, the soft, melancholy notes filling the room. The sound stopped me in my tracks, the weight of the day melting away as I listened. "You play?" I asked, my voice breaking the spell of the music. Aaron looked up, his expression softening as he met my gaze. "Yeah, it's therapeutic, I guess. Helps me think." I hesitated for a moment before sitting down beside him. The couch dipped slightly under my weight, and I was acutely aware of the small space between us. "You're good," I said, nodding toward the guitar. "Why didn't you ever mention it?" He shrugged, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "You never asked." There it was again, that quiet, unassuming confidence that seemed to define him. I watched as his fingers moved over the strings with practiced ease, the music soft and haunting. It was mesmerizing, the way his hands seemed to glide effortlessly, the way the notes seemed to carry a piece of him in every chord. "Play something for me," I said, leaning back against the cushions. "Something that means something to you." Aaron hesitated, his fingers stilling on the strings. For a moment I thought he was going to refuse, but then he nodded, his gaze dropping to the guitar. He started to play, the melody slow and deliberate, each note resonating with a quiet intensity. It was beautiful, achingly so, and I found myself caught in the emotion of it, the way the music seemed to speak what words couldn't. When he finished, the silence that followed was heavy, charged with something unspoken. I looked at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "That was incredible," I said softly, the words feeling inadequate. Aaron met my gaze, his expression unreadable. "Thanks." There was a pause, and then he added, almost as an afterthought, "It's not the music. It's the person listening." The words hit me like a punch to the chest, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. The way he said it, the way his eyes held mine, it was as if he were bearing a piece of himself, a piece he had kept hidden until now. And in that moment, I knew there was no going back. The weight of Aaron's words hung in the air, pressing against the space between us. I felt the warmth of his gaze, the intensity of it making my skin prickle as though I'd been touched. My mind raced, searching for something, anything, to say that might ease the tension that had settled over the room. But no words came. Nothing felt sufficient to meet the quiet vulnerability in his eyes. "Aaron," I began, my voice catching on his name. His expression didn't shift, but the faintest twitch of his lips hinted at a suppressed smile. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly, his fingers idly strumming a quiet chord on the guitar. "I just wanted you to know." Know what? That he saw me in a way no one else ever had? That he'd somehow found a way to reach a part of me I hadn't even realized I'd closed off? My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat loud and insistent, echoing the unspoken truth between us. He set the guitar aside and leaned back, his arm draping casually over the back of the couch, his movements as effortless as always. The shift brought him closer to me, the warmth of his presence wrapping around me like a cocoon. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Aaron," I said again, his name barely more than a whisper. "I don't know what to do with this." He tilted his head slightly, his expression thoughtful. "You don't have to do anything," he said simply. "Not unless you want to." The openness in his words startled me. There was no pressure, no expectation, just a quiet offering, a space for me to choose. It was disarming, the way he seemed to understand me so completely, the way he left the door open without pushing me to walk through it. The words caught in my throat and I shook my head, unable to finish the sentence. My hands were trembling, and I clasped them tightly together in my lap, trying to steady myself. Aaron's gaze flicked to my hands, and without hesitation he reached out, covering them with his own. His touch was warm, grounding, and I felt a shiver run through me as his fingers brushed against mine. "You don't have to say anything," he said again, his voice steady, soothing. "Just be here, with me." Something in the way he said it, so simple, so honest, broke through the wall I hadn't realized I'd been building. I let out a shaky breath, nodding as I unclenched my hands and let them rest beneath his. His fingers tightened slightly, a silent reassurance, and I felt the knot of tension in my chest begin to loosen. We sat there in silence, the air between us heavy with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings. The soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen was the only sound, a quiet reminder of the world beyond this moment. But I couldn't focus on anything outside of him. His presence, his touch, the way his eyes never left mine. "I've never." I started, the words faltering as I searched for a way to explain what I was feeling. "I've never felt like this before." Aaron's lips curved into a faint smile and he leaned closer, his movements slow and deliberate, as if giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. I didn't. I couldn't. "Neither have I," he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. The space between us seemed to shrink, the air growing warmer, thicker, as his gaze dropped to my lips and then back to my eyes. "But I don't want to run from it." His words sent a jolt through me, a surge of something I couldn't quite name. Desire, fear, exhilaration, all tangled together in a mess of emotions that left me breathless. He was so close now that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin, the scent of him, a mix of cedar and something clean, sharp, filling my senses. I wanted to say something, to break the tension, but before I could, Aaron closed the remaining distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in the softest, most tentative kiss. It was like a question, a gentle nudge, as if he were asking for permission without words. For a moment I froze, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. This was Aaron, my roommate, my friend, the person I trusted to share my space and my life, and yet, in that instant, all of the boundaries that had seemed so clear before blurred into nothingness. I didn't think. I couldn't. I just leaned into him, letting myself respond, letting myself feel. The kiss deepened, and I felt his hand slide up to cup the back of my neck, his fingers tangling in my hair. His touch was firm but gentle, and I melted into it, into him, as if I'd been waiting for this moment without even realizing it. My hands found their way to his shoulders, and I felt the tension in his body, the way he was holding himself back as though afraid of moving too quickly. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard, the air around us charged with an intensity that left me dizzy. Aaron rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his breath warm against my skin. "Elliot," he murmured, his voice low and rough, filled with something I couldn't quite name. "Tell me this isn't just me." I shook my head, my own voice trembling as I replied, It's not. It's not just you." His eyes opened then, meeting mine with a look so raw, so filled with emotion that it took my breath away. "I don't know where this is going," he said softly, his hand still cradling the back of my neck, "but I want to find out. With you." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and doubts, but beneath it all, there was a quiet certainty, a feeling I couldn't ignore. This, whatever it was, felt right. It felt real. Aaron's lips curved into a small, almost shy smile, and he leaned in again, brushing his lips against mine in a kiss that was softer, slower, filled with a tenderness that made my chest ache. I let myself sink into it, into him, into the moment that felt like it had been waiting for us all along. The days that followed were a blur of unspoken words and quiet glances that lingered too long. Aaron and I didn't talk about the kiss, not directly, but it was there, a presence that hovered between us, reshaping the way we moved around each other. The air felt heavier, charged with a tension that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Every time our hands brushed or our eyes met, it felt like the world tilted just slightly, as if nothing would ever be the same again. I caught myself watching him more often now, noticing things I hadn't allowed myself to notice before. The way his jaw tightened when he was deep in thought, the way his fingers drummed against the counter when he was restless, the way his lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile when he caught me staring. He never said anything about it, but the look in his eyes told me he noticed. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching a movie, the space between us felt impossibly small. My focus wasn't on the screen, but on the way Aaron's hand rested on the cushion between us, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin. The faint glow of the TV lit up his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his jaw, the slight curve of his lips. I wanted to reach out, to close the gap, but my nerves held me frozen in place. "You're quiet tonight," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence. I glanced at him, startled. "Just tired," I lied, my voice barely above a whisper. Aaron didn't reply right away. He turned his head, his eyes locking onto mine, and I felt the air shift, the weight of his gaze making my heart race. "Elliot," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with something deeper. "What's going on?" I opened my mouth to respond, to deflect, but the look in his eyes stopped me. There was no judgment there, no impatience, just quiet understanding, as though he could see straight through me. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "I don't know," I admitted finally, my voice trembling. I don't know how to do this." Aaron's expression softened and he shifted closer, his hand brushing against mine. The touch was so light, so tentative, but it sent a jolt through me that made it impossible to focus on anything else. "You don't have to know," he said gently. "We'll figure it out. Together." The simplicity of his words, the quiet assurance in his tone, made my chest ache. I nodded, unable to speak, and Aaron's hand closed over mine, his fingers warm and steady. We stayed like that for a moment, the weight of the unspoken stretching between us. Then, slowly, he leaned in, his movements deliberate, giving me every chance to pull away. I didn't. I couldn't. When his lips met mine, it was different this time. There was no hesitation, no tentativeness, just a quiet intensity, a sense of inevitability that made my breath catch in my throat. His hand moved to cup my face, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek, and I felt myself melt into him, into the moment that felt like it had been waiting for us all along. Aaron deepened the kiss, his other hand finding its way to my waist, pulling me closer. The warmth of his body, The way his touch sent shivers down my spine was almost too much to bear. My hands found their way to his shoulders, my fingers gripping the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring myself to him. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were breathing hard, the air around us thick with tension. Aaron rested his forehead against mine, his eyes closed, his breath warm against my skin. "Tell me this is real," he murmured, his voice rough and unsteady. "It's real," I whispered, my voice trembling. "It's real." The next few days passed in a haze of stolen moments and quiet touches. We didn't talk about what was happening between us, but it was there, an unspoken truth that neither of us could ignore. Every glance, every brush of his hand against mine felt like a promise, a quiet assurance that we were in this together. But with the intensity of our connection came an undercurrent of fear of what this meant, of what it could become. I found myself second-guessing everything, questioning whether I was ready for something so profound, so consuming. And yet, every time I looked at Aaron, every time he smiled at me or reached for my hand, the doubts melted away, leaving only the quiet certainty that this, whatever it was, felt right. One night, as we sat on the balcony overlooking the city, the cool night air wrapping around us, Aaron broke the silence. "Elliot," he said, his voice soft but steady, "I don't want to hide this." His words startled me, and I turned to look at him, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" He met my gaze, his eyes serious but filled with warmth. "I mean us. Whatever this is, whatever we're figuring out, I don't want to pretend it doesn't exist." I swallowed hard, the weight of his words settling over me. It's a lot," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I don't know if I'm ready for—" "You don't have to be," Aaron interrupted gently, his hand closing over mine. "We'll take it one step at a time. No pressure, no expectations, just us." The simplicity of his words, the quiet conviction in his tone, made my chest ache. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat, and Aaron's hand tightened around mine. The silence that followed wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was filled with quiet understanding, a shared connection that didn't need words. As the weeks passed, Aaron and I found a rhythm, a quiet balance that felt natural despite the complexity of our feelings. We didn't rush, didn't push, but let things unfold in their own time. And through it all, there was a sense of inevitability, a quiet certainty that this, whatever it was worth holding on to. The first time we spent the night together, it wasn't planned or orchestrated. It was quiet, simple, filled with a tenderness that left me breathless. Aaron's touch was warm and steady, his kisses slow and deliberate, as though savoring every moment. There was no urgency, no rush, just the quiet intensity of two people discovering something rare and real. As we lay tangled together in the quiet of the night, the world outside faded into nothingness. Aaron's hand rested against my cheek, his thumb brushing lightly over my skin, and I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "For what?" Aaron asked, his voice low and filled with warmth. "For being you," I said simply, my heart full. Aaron's lips curved into a faint smile, and he pressed a soft kiss to my forehead. Always. In that moment, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever doubts or fears we might face, we would face them together. Because this connection, this love, was worth everything. And as I drifted off to sleep in his arms, I felt a quiet certainty settle over me. This was just the beginning, and it was ours.